Hi, everyone. Really nice to be here. I'm not new to Leeds. I've been here at also the university for a number of times for conferences and things like that. But obviously come to talk about my new book is the first time. So thank you very much for offering this opportunity. And I'm really glad to be here to tell you a little bit about the book, but more importantly, to hope to have a conversation and discussion with you on this interesting topic in terms of intercultural communication with China. So I thought I start a little bit, just tell you who I am. And I think most of the images are quite self-telling. These are the universities I studied, worked, some books on language education, some like the series about navigating China, Bridging the Gap is the first one, is more books for general audience to engage with China. What do you think about the food in the middle? Getting everyone to get their appetite up. What does that tell about me? Any guesses? Where I'm from? Yes, where? Xi'an, no. Shanghai, yes, because crab, river crab and rice cake, by the way, it's not sweet, huh? It's, it's a very typical and famous dishes only in Shanghai because you get the river crab. And also, what about the numbers? What do you think 23 means here? The number 23. No. Yeah, so far, I've now spent 23 years in this country, studying, working, living. And last year was quite significant because my time spent in the UK surpassed for the first time my time living in China. So in terms of cultural identity, it's a quite interesting turning point for me. And last question, what about 46? What do you think? Once I ask a group of Chinese students and they say, oh, is that your age? I said it could be right. But obviously, I was giving a training to a group of diplomatic students. I said, okay, but in the West, you don't ask ladies' age. So I wouldn't make such diplomatic mistake about putting the number out there. So 46 are the countries that I've visited so far. And I think that I want to say, knowing a new culture and appreciate different places has been a really important part of my life. And in a way, intercultural communication has been a really important part of my life because as a student, international student coming from China, without learning about English, without understanding how the system works here, I wouldn't be able to do what I do now. And I definitely wouldn't be here and telling you about my new book. So that kind of leads to a very common question I get. So why did you write this book? I think partly, as I explained, in terms of my personal journey, right? And I work in the language department. All my colleagues are from different cultural background and linguistic background. And that's very, very important. But the other dimension why I decided to write this book is through my professional experience teaching students at LSE, as well as the executive students through our Confucius Institute for Business London, is that there is a gap in our understanding about China, Chinese language, and therefore we need to bridge that for better understanding and better communication, of course, then better business. So I want to demonstrate my point by doing a little test. It's something I usually do with my students as well. So we have some Chinese audience here as well, which is great. But I want everyone to participate, right? So please raise your hand if you know the name of this painting. Pretty much everyone, great. And please raise your hand if you know the artist who painted this. And please raise your hand if you know the cultural significance of this painting and why make it famous. Quite a lot of you. Yes, okay. So, how many of you know the name of this painting? Okay, we have we have some hands up, but pretty much all Chinese, kind of. Let's see. And okay, if you don't know the name of this painting, I think it would be quite difficult if I ask you if you know the painter, the artist of this painting. Okay. Well, even, oh, very good, very good. And also what make it famous in Chinese history? Ah, very good. So this is Qingming Shanghe Tu, okay? So this is the riverside painting during Qingming Festival. And this painting actually has a reputation of the China's Mona Lisa, okay? And that's one of the most favorite painting of the last emperor. He actually took it with him when he fled the Forbidden City. And this painting is very well known in China, first for its length, but more importantly, for its contribution in anthropology, because during this painting, it captured over 800 different characters in vivid detail and demonstrate how people actually live back in Song Dynasty. That's why what makes this painting famous. Now, I'm not here to turn everyone into Chinese artists, but if I do the same exercise in China, most of the Chinese students will be raising their hands. They know a little bit about West. They know about Mona Lisa, but we have a little bit lack or less understanding when it comes to China. I just want to demonstrate a little bit with visual. But when we come to the numbers as well, so you can see Chinese is actually the most well-spoken language in the world in terms of native or first language, right? And Nelson Mandela famously said, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. And if you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. So if you think about a market with 1.3 billion people, and if you can tap into that their heart, it's surely a good thing for your business. And we can see in recent years, so this is the data from 2015, we've got about 30 million people globally now studying Mandarin Chinese. And English obviously continue to be the dominant language for millions of learners who studying it. I have a quick question. So these are the 30 million people globally learning Mandarin Chinese. How many Chinese people are learning English? What do you think? All of them? All of them? Okay, so here's the data I have. So in 2015, we've got over 300 million Chinese students learning English, and in 2019, it's increasing to over 400 million. So again, that tells you something about where people invest their time and where people, spend their time to learn about each other's language. And how does all that then reflect in our daily life? So I want to give you a couple of examples where this gap actually makes a difference in our political life, diplomacy, as well as, of course, business. So I don't know how many of you remember this. In 2018, the former Prime Minister of UK, Theresa May, and her husband visited Shanghai during Chinese New Year. So they participated in this traditional Chinese New Year activity, which is paper cutting. And they were cutting this Chinese character where they're folding. Fu means good fortune. Okay. So here we have the Chinese media on the day having this picture showing how the couple enjoy the activity. And then back in London, where I now live, so this is Evening Standard, and they said, look, this in the middle here is the right way of writing this Chinese character. And look at the couple, such an embarrassment for the country because they do not know how to hold the Chinese character correctly. They did it upside down, the other way around. How is it possible? This is so embarrassing, right? So my question to you, which is the right way? Upside down, which one? This one? So what's wrong with this one, the right way? Yeah, thank you. So they are both right in a way, right? So this is how we normally write the Chinese character we see in the book. However, during Chinese New Year, people would hold it or hang it as a, decoration deliberately upside down. That's because of the unique nature of Chinese language. We have many homophones. So 福到了, when it's originally in the history served as a warning, you saw people did the wrong thing, you say 福到了, your 福 is upside down when you want to point out the other person made a mistake. But it actually sounded the same as 福到了. Different character means your good fortune has just arrived. So it became a Chinese New Year best wishes to send to each other. So why am I citing this example? I think partly, very importantly, we talk about Chinese language, the context is really important. But the other dimension of it is that imagine you were just general public. You didn't know anything about Chinese language and anything about Chinese culture. When you read this media, you probably think, oh, yes, what did our prime minister do, right? Because you didn't have any understanding in deciding what information is right and what information is wrong. And I always tell my students that you don't want to be that, right? You want to have enough knowledge and enough understanding to be able to make your own judgment rather than being misled by media. Sometimes it does happen. And then moving on to business. So in 2019 May, this is in Hong Kong, IKEA launched a tofu flavor ice cream. So that was their advertisement at the time. And it was in Cantonese. So basically the tagline says, as long as you want, you can come and eat my tofu at any time. But this ad was taken down just within 24 hours. There's a lot of backslash and saying how poor taste this advertisement was. Any guesses why that is? Sex harassment. Okay, so for those of you who does like Chinese tofu, okay, we probably all like mapo tofu. So you need to be a bit careful because 吃豆腐, eat tofu, yes, it literally means to eat tofu. However, especially when it's used in this particular construction, when you say eat someone's tofu, that means to sexually harass the other person. So it becomes a really derogative expression. So you can imagine when this happened, all the, feminists went mad, right? All this pink color and say you can come, harass me at any time. What were you thinking, right? So that was just a very big failure when it comes to advertisements. And another example, so this was in 2016. I saw the Chinese students audience already laughing. So 2016, when I launched this very special edition, actually, for the Chinese New Year of Monkey. So this is their design. And you can see they put two really lovely Chinese characters with big meaning, right? So Fa means getting rich, and Fu, I've explained earlier, that means good fortune, and the fortune arrived. And look, they went for the red color, right? You can't go wrong with red during Chinese New Year. And they put the Chinese character Fu upside down. So they were following the right thing. And unfortunately, the sales didn't take off at all. So my question again is, what do you think? Discrimination. Discrimination? No. What do you think? Yeah, so from a very individualistic point of view, if you look at each component, they are fine, right? But the Chinese mindset, we are very comprehensive and we have a holistic perspective. So when you put these two Chinese characters together, it's a polite way to say someone is putting on weight. So it's going to be ridiculous to wear a pair of shoes saying I'm getting fat, right, during Chinese New Year. So no one was really buying it. And I felt really sorry for the designer because it was a lovely design. And it just, unfortunately, when you put these two characters together, it starts to not make sense. So these are some of the mistakes like really big business also make. And what does it tell us is that I feel, intercultural miscommunication a lot of times is an aspect that being underestimated by business. They always think about, how we can make more money, but they didn't realize actually any increase in miscommunication culturally will actually be costly. So I think that's something definitely worth remembering. So this is kind of summarize, why I feel we really need this book, try to really bridge the gap of understanding in terms of China, and whether it is just to show genuine respect to the counterpart you work with, or have a better awareness of who you are dealing with, right? You need to have some of understanding both directions. When it comes to the structure of the book, so it's kind of break into three parts. The what, so I want to start talk about, a little bit about the Chinese language itself. What is the communication like? What is the digital communication nowadays like, right? So the what is just really offer a description of what the Chinese communication is about. And then I moved to why. So why is kind of, so now you've know what Chinese communication or language is like, but why do they do like that? Why do they communicate in this particular way, right? And then last part is moving to how. So this is quite practical element in terms of, so how do you then adapt your communication style? How can you then negotiate? And how can you build rapport, etc. So I just want to sort of then pick up a couple of points from each section of the book. The first section, when I talk about the what, the key message I want to highlight here is that language is really important. Language is a representation of Chinese culture. And I think some of the examples we've seen earlier already kind of demonstrated that. And the Chinese language in particular, it has deep connection with its history, with its culture. So there's a story, for example, why 吃豆腐, eat tofu is wrong, is connected with sexual harassment. There is a story why 福到了, 福 is put upside down, right? And there's also story about many of the Chinese expressions, idioms. And I think this is very important for us to understand. And then the second dimension is that language actually reflects the thinking pattern. That is something really important and useful for business. So I want to show very simple example to demonstrate the link between language and culture and the way we think. A lot of times we don't even recognize it. So let's take the first example. It's just our names, right? So first of all, we know based on Hofstede cultural dimension, China is more leaning towards collective society, and the UK, for example, is more leaning towards individualistic culture. But how does our language also reflect that? So my name, you can see on the top, starts with my family name. So that shows you where I'm coming from, the group identity. Then my given name, so what my parents want me to be, right? And finally, doctor, so what career or profession I choose to be later in my life as an individual. So group and then individual. And my colleague's name from LSE, Dr. Neil Duncan McLean, you can see exactly the opposite direction. Individual, who this person is, start first and moving to surname. Another couple of examples showing how our thought moving from general to specific or specific to general is you can see simply how we tell time and address work in opposite directions. So these simple examples obviously expand to how we draft an email, how we construct an article, more importantly, how we reason and how we persuade. We have a very different way of communicating our message, thinking that will resonate better with the audience. And this is very, very important. And language and understanding of how language work is a reflection of then you understand how the thought process work. And in the why part, I think most of you are quite familiar with Edward Hall's cultural iceberg. So that's part of the reason I start with what we can observe through language. And then moving on to the why. The why is the invisible, but really, really important element to understand the what. So that includes beliefs, attitude, right? And, philosophy. So in that section, I focus on Chinese beliefs about communication and Chinese cultural values, and then key Chinese cultural words. And I thought through this, we can then understand why Chinese communicate in a particular way. And taking it as an example, one of the questions I get to ask quite a lot by executive students in business is they often ask Catherine, what is the negotiation style of Chinese businessmen? And I said, okay, so it feels to me that your question seemed to assume there's only one style. But actually, so I really like Professor Tony Fang from University of Stockholm. He has this description of a Chinese negotiator is a combination of a Maoist bureaucrat, a Confucius gentleman, and a Sun Tzu style strategist. So what does that tell you is that Chinese negotiation is actually a combination of competition and cooperation. But when do you want to become a more gentleman-like, and when you turn into competitor, like use the Sun Tzu strategy, that depends on how close you know each other, which stage of the negotiation, and what's the outcome you try to drive. So to negotiate with China and a Chinese negotiator have different styles that they can adapt and root it back to its history and its philosophical underpinning. And the other thing, early on, when Francis asked people about what comes to their mind about intercultural communication, and I thought I was really happy to see a lot of people talk about nonverbal communication. And that's definitely the case. And that's really, really important in understanding Chinese communication as well. And I thought this is really interesting. Earlier, we talked about Chinese language being very contextual based, and we talk about negotiation. One of the things, even the Chinese character to listen can tell us a lot about what Chinese actually think about listening. Okay, so this is the Chinese character to listen. And as you would probably expect it, there's this Chinese character ear. Of course, if you listen, you need your ears, right? But if you notice, there's only one ear. And in contrast, we have the Chinese character eyes, and the tongue on the top is the Chinese number 10. So you need 10 eyes, 5 pairs of eyes, only one ear. So what does that tell you? So to really observe, right, and to look at the nonverbal aspect of your speaker is more important just to focus on what's being said to you. So observing, pay attention to that is very, very important. Then you have the mind to engage with the speaker intellectually, but also you need your heart to engage with the speaker emotionally, and you have to pay full attention. So I thought ancient Chinese worked out what we call active listening quite a long time ago. And that really tells you communication. And like many audience already said, it's really important not just only focus on language, but also the nonverbal aspect. So in the final part of the book, when I talk about how, it's really trying to help readers to develop this, what we call intercultural communicative competence. So this model is very famously proposed by Professor Michael Byron in 1997. And we can see the intercultural communicative competence is right in the center. This model doesn't necessarily just say, oh, this is applying to China, but it is more broadly that we can think about intercultural communication in general. So the most important aspect is attitude. I think some of the keywords popped out earlier, talk about willingness and openness. That's really important. That's really the starting point. So next time when you work with someone from a different culture, instead of getting annoyed, think, why is this person thinking like that? Okay, I'm right, they are wrong. Maybe take it as an opportunity to learn and think about why and stay curious. Knowledge. So knowledge is a little bit like what I've mentioned earlier, you know, a little bit about art, a little bit about history, a little bit about philosophy. So what you can learn about the culture that you want to engage. Skills of interpreting and relating. So this is actually really, really important. A lot of times when you engage with people from different cultural backgrounds, not only that you're learning about them, but actually you're discovering about yourself. So I have an Italian partner at home. So one of our ongoing struggle is that, so he actually cooks at home. I'm very lucky. And so he would expect me to say thank you and please. So he would say, Catherine, you know, you're not in the restaurant. And I'm like, yeah, exactly, because I'm not in the restaurant. I'm not going to say please or thank you with you all the time. Because in Chinese culture, when you're close with someone, you don't say please and thank you. I don't say please and thank you with my parents because that puts distance between us. So I realized I slip into that, you know, habit of dropping the thank you and please, because actually I'm following the Chinese mindset of insider outsider effect. But for him, he thought I was just being a bit rude, right? So that is the skill of, you know, how do you interpret, for example, we all celebrate Chinese New Year and here we celebrate Christmas. So what does that mean? What does that tell about your own culture and how is it similar or different when we celebrate this kind of activities? Skills of discovery and interaction. This is a really big one. And I think this just happens every time you travel, every time you learn a language, every time you move abroad. All this is, even you watch a movie, right? So this is the opportunity for you to discover more and interact. And, you know, developing intercultural communicative competence is a lifelong learning process. It's through interaction with other people. You think, oh, actually this conversation is a bit awkward. Maybe I made a mistake, but next time you will learn. And finally, is really to get to this critical cultural awareness. So what does that mean? Is that then you can feel quite comfortable in switching your behavior or switching your code based on the context. So for example, when I went to China on business, I will know that seating arrangement is really, really important. And whether it's going out for dinner or it's a formal meeting, so I will never sit down until someone say, you know, this is your seat. But in the UK, it's a little bit more flexible, right? And also the similar example that I mentioned, I think here, I pick up the habit of saying sorry a lot all the time. But obviously, when I travel to China, I might not do that, right? So there's a bit of habit. You can understand how formality works and what is required to be considered appropriate, polite in your culture, and how you can adapt to a different culture. So you can kind of switch quite comfortably. And I mentioned earlier in the book that I provide some tools and strategies to help readers to engage with the audience. And I think there's a lot out there that we can really draw from applied linguistics. And I'm really pleased to see some of the audience, you know, working in this field. So these are the 6 different theories. So obviously in the book, I don't specifically talk about theories, but more importantly is to hopefully include some of the key aspects of the theories and to make it much more digestible and applicable for the readers. Because of time, I do want to leave more time for discussion. So for example, the speaking model. So this is for me, I think it's a very important and interesting model to help us to decode context. So we talked about earlier, Chinese communication is very context-based, but how do you go about it, right? Speaking model. So here you can see actually each letter is representing a particular aspect of the speech context you're going to move into. Any guesses? What do you think S means? S means setting, right? So it can be the physical environment. For example, the setting here, I'm in a lecture hall, and that means I'm talking or I'm doing most of the talking, you are listening. It will be very different if we move to a cocktail party, right? So everyone will mingling and talking. And P is participants. So obviously who's going to be involved in that conversation and what kind of, role relations and the power dynamic is very important. So basically the speaking model really become a checklist. When you move into an important meeting, having really important negotiation, you can go through one by one, think about, oh, have I considered this? Do I need to do a little more homework to understand who I'm dealing with and what's the best way to approach this? So I think in the book, basically, just want to provide with the readers some of the linguistic techniques that to help them to really decode context and have better rapport with Chinese counterpart. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I was very fortunate to get some advanced praises from different people. And actually, Sherrod was just meeting Chinese Premier Li Qiang yesterday in Beijing. So on behalf of CBBC, China-Britain Business Council, and he happened to be the chair of our advisory council, and I'm really pleased he really endorsed my book. And actually, I mentioned earlier, Bridging the Gap is the first one of the whole theory in terms of navigating China. So the next one is called Harmony in Differences. So this is really focusing on politeness. So we might think we all want to be polite, but the way we want to be polite is very different, right? So this is going to be focusing on the Chinese perspective of politeness. And the last one, East meets West. So basically, this is going to be an interview style book looking at leaders from different culture, particularly if they have extensive experience working with China. So I want to gain insights in terms of how they navigate leadership, team building, etc. So I look forward to have some discussion with you, and feel free to get in touch. The best way to get in touch with me is email or follow me on LinkedIn. Thank you very much for your time.
I will get this second mic turned on as well, because we'll use the microphone for questions, and I will get the other screen up on here as well. So excuse me while I do that. We have had some questions submitted on Vivox here already. But what I'd like to do is come onto that Q&A and find the way. I know I was going to, there, you can see that one now. Great. And I want to put on my Q&A here. So do let us know here in the audience if you have a question that you would like to ask. Can you get that turned on for me, please? And we'll get a mic to you so everyone can hear online as well. But Catherine, I think some of this question does start to get to things that people here may be thinking of as well. So maybe we could start with what advice you'd give someone teaching Chinese students to encourage them to get more involved in class discussion?
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting question. I actually get to ask a lot because I think in all UK university, we do have growing number of Chinese students, and this seemed to be a fairly common question or challenge sometimes. I wondered, this is interesting. Why I find this interesting is the word encourage them. So what advice would you give to someone teach Chinese students to encourage them to get more involved in class discussion? So the reason I want to highlight to encourage them, I think this for me, so this is probably, I don't know, is it going to be a British teacher or someone?
This, I think I know who submitted this. It came in beforehand, so they're not here right now, but it is someone who works a lot with Chinese students and has tried various things to understand more the different perspectives. Yeah.
So I think one way, obviously, to look at it is the question itself to encourage them. So it feels like, you know, if you think about the teacher-student relationship, what do you expect the teacher to be and what do you expect the student to do? So here, this teacher think, you know, I should give students options, right? I'm not going to tell them what to do. What I'm going to do is to encourage them. So this is a more equal and fair, or, you know, kind of a equal relationship, I would say, you know, in terms of status. And so on the flip side, so if you think about Chinese culture, and if you think about teacher-Chinese student role relationship in China, the dynamic is very different. So student would expect the teacher to be the leader, to tell them what to do, okay? And so if the teacher do not necessarily explicitly ask a particular student to answer a question, the student might not necessarily volunteer themselves. So one way I would say to think about this question might be, or to solve this problem, might actually be, you might not really need to encourage them, you just ask them. So if you ask them, and if you, not in a, you know, kind of you, that kind of way, but if you think about your class design, if you think about your activity, already by design, you give students the opportunity to have to say something, then you don't have this problem, right? So this is the teacher side. I think there's some kind of perception from teacher side, students should be encouraged. I'm not there to name them to answer the question, but I'm telling you from a Chinese student's perspective, because they see you in a more powerful position, higher status, if you ask them to actually say something, they would. So that could be built into your classroom dynamic. Then there's the other side. So why Chinese students don't speak up or they don't volunteer as much as the Western students in the classroom? So that's the other dimension. And I think that's quite a lot with being modest. And that's quite a lot about saving face. So being modest because you don't want to always be the smart one, every question, I know. That doesn't reflect good on your peer, right? If you think about being a very collective, group-oriented harmony society. But then at the same time, if you say something wrong in public, and then you risk losing your face. So why would you do that, right? So these would be the potential psychological barriers for Chinese students. If you just say, would you like to say something? Then the safer option is maybe not. But as teachers, once we understand these dynamics and the potential, you know, psychological barrier for students, one thing is to create a friendly, warm environment. Second is through with your classroom design. And actually, you don't have to encourage, you can ask students to participate directly. And I'm sure if you do that, and provided it's a safe environment, they will participate and speak up.
I'm resisting the urge to come up to just one of you now with a microphone. I am going to throw that question out to the room here. Is there anyone here who wants to ask a question before I go ahead and continue with what I have on here and from the Padlet as well? You'll warm up soon, I know. I am going to. So Catherine, you've hinted, you've talked about so many things and like that tip of the iceberg and what's underneath it. But let's get some of these kind of practical tips or situations. So someone who is here or something popping up, excellent. Someone's mentioned about reading a lot of papers by Chinese authors and worrying about any potential faux pas when reaching out to the authors of those papers. So we've got an individual reaching out to authors of a paper. I'm assuming academic. I don't know if you're here. And another thing that came up in the Padlet was people thinking about research links with Chinese universities. So on an organizational level, building relationships for research, what kind of aspects or tips do we need to think about?
So the first question, I wasn't sure why the person would feel being rude when reaching out to them. I think working in academia, if people interested about your paper and want to collaborate, is normally a kind of a positive thing. I think maybe one thing that come to my mind immediately is maybe term of address, which is quite important in Chinese culture. So I think I can give you the opposite example. When our China director arrived in this country, she was totally shocked every time she said, I receive email just with hi or hello, that's it. And she was like so shocked by this kind of opening line because she would be expecting, dear Professor Wang, right? Things like that. So I think maybe that's the one thing, right? In terms of term of address, to show respect and to show goodwill, then just to stay on the formal side until you become partners, then you can drop that. But otherwise, I think reaching out to Chinese colleagues, Chinese authors are definitely fine. I don't see any potential, issues or mistakes that I can think of. And which was the other question you mentioned?
It wasn't actually one that was on here, but thinking about that context of building relationships on a more institutional level or higher level of research partnerships with a university. Maybe the things you said about waiting to sit down at a dinner, for example, is one practical tip. What kind of factors might help build those relationships effectively?
It's interesting. I think that linked to this Chinese idea of 关系, which I did mention in my book, talking about how we tend to want to trust the people that you already know. And I don't think it's necessarily new, or different to many other cultures, but I think in Chinese culture, just tend to be maybe more like that. So I give you one example. We had a delegation from a university in China want to talk about collaboration with, the summer school or executive program at LSE. There's no reason that they couldn't just send, whoever on the website an email and introduce themselves and say, we're organizing this trip. Can we arrange to meet? Here it will be really common. You can do that for sure. But they felt that's not the best way either to present themselves or maybe just reach out directly. What they would do is then, just because they know me and I'm Chinese, so they decided they want to come to me first and talk to me and ask me whether I can make an intro instead of them reaching out directly, because they know there's a little bridger almost in the middle, and that makes them feel more comfortable. So I think having type of work relationship, if you feel a little bit difficult to reach out directly, a lot of times it does work with 关系 through the people you know, and if they can make an intro for you, it would make the success rate much higher. There's one question actually about my name. I'm very keen to answer that. There's one question about, now it's gone. So I think the Chinese audience here, they saw my Chinese name. So my name is just 2 characters, right? So Xiang, the Chinese surname. So basically went back to warring period. So Xiang Yu as the king of the West Chu. So that's kind of the family name. So kind of tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. But I think the given name is very interesting. So Hua. So many times when people hear Hua, they would say, oh, flowers, is that your name? Flower. I'm like, no, it's nothing to do with flower, but it actually has something to do with horse. Because if you look at the Chinese character, Hua, so it has the horse radical. And then on the other side is the Chinese character Hua, means significant or splendid. So this Chinese character Hua referring to a very, very unique breed of horse, which is kind of red color horse. So it's a metaphor because I was born in the year of horse. So it's kind of a metaphor for my parents want me to be an excellent person. So I was quite enjoying explaining my name. And it's a quite unusual Chinese character. And yeah, always I have to say, no, it's not flower. It's actually something to do with horse. And people get very confused and look at me until I have to explain the whole thing. Yeah.
Does anyone want to ask their question live on the mic themselves, or shall I continue reading it out? Oh, we've got a question here. I've got to go and let this happen.
Hi. It's just a small clarification, actually. You mentioned about using the full name in an email greeting line. And I wasn't quite sure if that was because you, in the example, it was to a university professor. Or would you expect, excuse me, would you expect that to be used for anybody? For context, work at the business school in communications. So I email students a lot. And I will, depending on the context of the email, I'll often do a big mail merge, but I'll shorten it down to just first name to be being a little bit more friendly. But is that a bad thing to do in terms of Chinese context? Would it be better to have the full name?
It's less necessary about the full name, but more about their title. So in a business setting, if you know their job title, for example, if you know they're engineer, you know if they're teacher, they are maybe, I don't know, doctor. So it's really, really important, or it's more common to have the Chinese surname followed by their job title as kind of indicating who they are. So that's much more conventional in a business setting. And until you have like really good rapport and you're really close, you're almost like partners, then in Chinese culture, it's quite interesting that people start to then call each other brothers or sisters, because family is very important. And people, even though they're completely not related at all, but they use this term to indicate we can trust each other and we have the obligation as brothers to each other. So we're gonna, trust each other and do good business. So that kind of evolve as well. It depends on how close the relationship become. But I would say standard communication, it's very common surname plus job title. We even do it with Chinese colleagues among ourselves. So it doesn't work with the Western or other colleagues like in Spanish or French, but amongst ourselves, like Chinese language teachers, we still call each other 老师, means teacher. So we would say 张老师, Li 老师, that's how we call each other. We don't use first name.
Thank you.
Right, so we've got a couple still come up on here. One, have you got any words of encouragement for people who have a bit of Chinese to try? Someone says the Chinese is still very much a work in progress. How will that be received? Just go for it, right?
I think, first of all, well done to start a difficult language like Mandarin Chinese. And I think any language is a work in progress. Chinese is very difficult. And in China, the moment you say 你好, people just, say 你好 and start to speak Chinese with you. And they're super friendly that way. And I think to have just a little bit Chinese really takes you a long way. I think recently, as you know, Xi Jinping visited France, and the French premier started saying just a couple of lines in Mandarin, say Chinese, and say his Chinese is not very good. He studied for a year, but it really made a very good impression. So I think language, of course, you know, I'm still improving my English as well. It's a very, you know, if you want to be really, really good in a language, it does take a lot of time and effort. But I think it's more about the attitude and about curiosity and about the goodwill you want to express in the language. I hope I answered that question.
Great. And a couple more. We've got about 5 minutes left. So get questions coming in. If we don't have chance, or you've got a question that comes through later on, Catherine will, I'm sure, help to answer, and she'll be here after, and there's still more books, and you'll have a chance to chat a bit more then as well. So 2 more questions here. Let's see if we can get through these. We've got one asking about advice for new graduates who want to work in intercultural communication. Is this something where you can find job opportunities, and how should they go about it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'm trying to understand, is it more like a consultancy or maybe academia? Because intercultural communication is a very broad term. So obviously in the book, I use a relatively narrow term to look at working cross-culturally, defining culture through a nation perspective. But intercultural communication is in a way much broader than that. It can be just different, you know, even different industries, we have different cultures. So that also depends how you define culture itself. So to start the first job in this field, I don't know. I mean, if you teach a foreign language, that's like in my head, that was a very, or any trade and outbound base or tourism. So all these are related to intercultural communication.
I mean, I think people like us would argue that should be relevant for so many jobs. Let's move on then to a quite specific example. Someone working with a lot of Chinese students. How can you support them and give feedback when you know technical language is difficult, even in your first language? Students are using Google Translate and getting maybe not the best translation, using these words wrong. So how do you give feedback? How do you tell people that is wrong, or correct it and provide support, but in a way that is, I'm saying support all the time, supportive?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. Actually, we in our language courses, it's not necessarily about essay writing, but it's more about well, essay writing, but in a second language, we constantly having these issues, right? Sometimes students just want to use Google Translate or ChatGPT nowadays. So we have actually come up at LSE a couple of small research projects. We will actually use the technology and then invite Chinese native speakers and provide a similar or comparative version. And then we then bring it and present to our student, ask them to critique and compare which version is better and why. So it's kind of, we still use technology, but we bring this awareness that technology sometimes can go horribly wrong, and how technology, the version produced by technology might differ from authentic native speaker, and get the students to understand the nuance that way, rather than maybe, of course, it's easy sometimes just to highlight this is not how you say it, right? But I think it's maybe, if time allows, because I think this kind of things always takes time to make them realize themselves that this is not the most effective